What is the measure that God is truly among a church? It's an important question, isn't it? Let's find out. Well, happy Wednesday, friends. My name is Brandon, pastor here at Church Unlimited. Welcome to your midweek boost where we're going to talk about the new covenant. The past 2 Sundays, we've been talking about tongues in the church, specifically from 1 Corinthians 14. Today, we'll cover the third and final part of this tongues conversation. All of this is in the series that we've called the Gifts of the Spirit. And so a quick reminder of what last week, where we ended in 1 Corinthians 14:18. Paul says, I thank God I speak with tongues more than you all. There's nothing really wrong with tongues as a whole, yet in the church, verse 19 says. In other words, where instruction is everything. This is what the whole chapter has been about, cleaning up the instruction, clearly communicating who Jesus is in a language that's understood by the hearers. In the church, I would rather speak 5 words with my understanding. If you live in America and you're an English-speaking church, I'd rather speak 5 words in English that I may teach others than 10,000 in a tongue. If I have an English-speaking room and I only speak in Russian, they will not understand any of the communication. Even though I'm saying great things, it must be interpreted, and that's the point of tongues in the church. Verse number 20, Brethren, don't be children in understanding. However, in malice, be babes, but in understanding, be mature. And ultimately, this is Paul bringing a severe rebuke to the Corinthians. If you're going to be a baby, let it be in regards to evil. But ultimately, when it comes to the gifts of the Spirit, speaking in tongues especially, you need to grow up. Moving on to verse 21. In the law, it is written, with men of other tongues, that would be languages, and other lips, I will speak to this people, that is the Jews of Israel. And yet for all that, these Jews, the unbelieving Jews, will not hear me. What Paul is doing is he's pulling out a statement from the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah acknowledges prophetically that one day the Jews will hear about God from another nation, a Gentile nation. This was blasphemy to a Jew. Why would a Gentile nation of a totally different tongue ever speak to me about God? We are the people of God. That would never happen. And yet what Paul is explaining is that when the Jews would hear other nations proclaiming the God of Israel to them, that would be a sign to them. But notice that these Jews would not hear it. They wouldn't believe it. So what we're doing is establishing the unbeliever that Paul's about to mention is referenced right here. Unbelieving Jews. Verse 22. Therefore, based on this prophecy from Isaiah, the Jews not believing, even though other tongues, languages would communicate, this was the issue. Therefore, tongues are for a sign, not to those who believe, but to unbelievers. Big question, who are the unbelievers? Is it just someone from the town across the street from you that they don't know anything about Jesus? They've been living a heathen life their entire lives? Or is the unbeliever someone that Paul already mentioned? And certainly he is, because it's his letter. And so the unbeliever, unbelieving Jews. Tongues would be a sign to the unbelieving Jews that Jesus is actually the Christ, not just another prophet. He's actually the Messiah. That's what tongues represented in this context. But prophesying is not for those unbelieving Jews, but for those who believe. That means prophecy is for edification, exhortation, and comfort. Just a few verses earlier. It's for the church of believers. So we see basically what Paul says here is hearing other nations proclaim the fulfillment of God's promises are a sign to unbelieving Jews that Jesus really is the Christ, other nations, other tongues. The gift of prophecy, however, is intended to build up the church that is the body of believers. Verse 23. Therefore, if the whole church comes together in one place and all the communicators speak with tongues, not the entire church, the ones that are standing up and communicating to the body, if they're all doing it in tongues, and there come in those who are uninformed. Last week we learned that is the lay person, not a public person, but someone that's private, just someone that wanders into the building. Or how would the unbelievers, that would be the unbelieving Jews, how will they not say that you're out of your mind? It matters as they come into the church what they hear. If all they hear is another language, that in of itself is not actually helpful to them. But if all prophesy, That is, clearly communicate Jesus. Here is a huge difference. If you only speak in tongues, nobody hears, nobody's blessed. But if you prophesy, that does not mean to predict, it means to proclaim. If you preach Jesus clearly, watch the result. An unbeliever or an uninformed person comes in and they're convinced by all of these messages. Convinced means proven wrong about their bad beliefs. They're convicted by all these prophecies. That means examined at the heart level, and thus the secrets of their heart are revealed. That is, he acknowledges the truth of the gospel. And watch what happens when he hears clearly the gospel, who Jesus is. And so falling down on his face, he will worship God and report that God is truly among you. The measure of God being among a church, it's not the number of humans in the church. It's not the great worship team the church has. It's not the amazing production or the awesome lights or the great LED wall behind the preacher. That's not the measure of God's presence among a church. Rather, the measure of God's presence is the clarity with which Jesus is proclaimed. That should encourage you, because if you're a pastor, for example, and you're proclaiming the gospel, the true gospel, you're not compromising to men's traditions, but you're preaching exactly who Jesus is and what he did as the Christ. Friends, God is among you. He's there to back up the conversation that's being had. On the other hand, if you're a church of 1,000, 10,000, 15,000 people, and people don't know who Jesus is, it's not that they wouldn't say they're Christians, but they don't know that the result of Christ is full righteousness, is entire forgiveness of sins. They don't understand that their forgiveness is not based on them, but on Jesus. If they don't get that, then God's not really among that congregation. They may feel good. They're glad they gathered. They're a great club, but they're not the church. A lot of people go clubbing on Sundays these days. In other words, they're going to a place where they find connection with humans. But the church is responsible to guard the gospel, to ensure that it lives on in perpetuity into future generations. Verse 26. How is it then, brethren? He's asking a question now. What then, basically, is the rule that should be observed regarding the use of the gifts of the Spirit? And here's what the Corinthians' current pattern looked like. This is an accusation. Paul says, whenever you come together, each of you has a psalm and a teaching and a tongue and a revelation and an interpretation. He's saying this is chaotic and it's wrong. Here's the answer to the question. What are the rules of use for the communication of the Spirit? Here are the rules. Let all things be done for edification. It's not about you. I think in essence what Paul is bringing out here is the highest thoughts in the minds of these Corinthian believers. It seems to be, how are they going to use their gift during the next church service? Maybe I'll teach, maybe I'll give a tongue, an interpretation, maybe I'll give a song. But instead of seeking a way to make you look good, what Paul is saying is the gifts are to be solely for the edification of the church. Instead of this argument of who's going to give the tongue, what Paul is saying is it's more important that if a tongue is given, an immediate interpretation comes, because Jesus has to be clearly portrayed. The Corinthian church would be, you'd have individuals stand up and sit down. You'd have prophets stand up and give a word. Another prophet would stand up. At times, 2 prophets, 3 prophets were speaking at a time. Simultaneous to that, someone was giving a tongue. There was a lot of disorder in this church, and that's where the following verses come from, 27, verse 27. If anyone speaks in a tongue, then let there be 2 or at most 3, each in turn, and let one interpret. I see the man Paul here giving instruction. If anyone should speak in a tongue, let there be 2. Okay, fine. I'll let you go with 3 in turn, and let one interpret. People that had the gift of tongues would stand up, and one person that everyone knew who had the gift of tongues may give a gift in another language. Maybe another followed. And then one person would stand up and interpret both. Verse 28, but if there is no interpreter, in other words, they knew the interpreter among them. If they didn't know the interpreter, then there would be no tongue. Because if Bob, the interpreter, didn't show up, then the giver of tongues must remain silent. That's the next part. If there's no interpreter, let him with the gift of tongues keep silent in church, and let him with the gift of tongues speak to himself and to God. And finally, in regards to prophets, he gives similar rules. Let 2 or 3 prophets. That's not people that predict the future. These are people that are proclaimers. They're spiritual communicators. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak. That would be in succession. And let the others judge. Who are the others? The others with the gift of prophecy. Let the others judge. But if anything is revealed to another prophet who sits by, then let the first keep silent. For you can all prophesy one by one. That does not mean everybody in the church had the gift of prophecy. It meant that the ones that do have it, you're going to get your turn. It may not be in this service. Come back to another gathering and you can have your turn. But ultimately, the goal is that all may learn and all may be encouraged about what? About who Jesus is, this new covenant. Not leaving any room for confusion about who Jesus is. And finally, the last 2 verses for today. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. In other words, Paul's saying you can hold it. I know you've got something important to say, but you can hold it. You don't have to say it today. Come back next time and maybe you'll have a chance. Why? Because God is not the author of confusion, but rather God is the author of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Communicating Jesus is what the church is here to do. If you hear a pastor and he doesn't have Jesus on the front of his lips, then something is wrong, friends. I'm not here just to be another life hack giver. I'm here to be a life giver, communicating the life of God to you. I pray this has been meaningful to you. I hope you have a marvelous rest of your week. Thanks for hanging out with us. We look forward to seeing you this weekend in Birmingham, or find us online at mychurchunlimited.com. God bless you guys. Have a great rest of your week. We'll see you soon.